All right. Welcome, everyone, to Sensation and Perception Part 1. We're going to focus on some broad foundational concepts in sensation and perception, and then we're going to move on specifically to our sense of sight. Part 2, we will finish up the rest of the senses. All right. So I like to start the sensation and perception unit talking about this wonderful case study with Heather Sellers. Heather Sellers is an author, and she suffers from something called prosopagnosia, which is also known as face blindness. It's important to note here that Heather Sellers has perfect vision. She has 20/20 vision. She doesn't need glasses, doesn't need contacts, but she cannot recognize faces. Think about how often you recognize faces in your daily life. You recognize people by their faces. You're walking through the hallways, you're talking to people on FaceTime or something like that. You see someone's face and you recognize who they are because of their face. Imagine not having that ability. Well, this is something that Heather Sellers has to live with. So here's a little excerpt from an interview with her. In college, on a date at the spaghetti station, I returned from the bathroom and plunked myself down in the wrong booth, facing the wrong man. I remained unaware he was not my date, even as my date, who was a stranger to me, accosted wrong booth guy, and then stormed out of the station. I can't distinguish actors in movies and on television. I do not recognize myself in photos or videos. I can't recognize my stepsons in the soccer pickup line. I failed to determine which husband was mine at a party, in the mall, at the market. So this is what it's like living with prosopagnosia or face blindness. You don't recognize people. You can't pick out your own relatives, your son, daughter, husband, wife, people who it should be really easy to recognize. People who suffer from prosopagnosia are not able to make those distinctions. So here's another great little example. So you've had a couple seconds to look at this picture now, and more than likely you're seeing a couple faces jump out at you in this image. This is a pretty famous image. Excuse me. It's called The Hills Have Eyes, or The Woods Have Eyes, something like that. I believe there's something like 12 or 14 different faces in here. I have taken the time to count them all before, but you can see, here's my mouse cursor, you can kind of see some faces back in the woods here, in the rocks here, in the branches here. Over here, here's a big one. Now, for people with healthy functioning visual cortices, these faces jump out at you. Recognizing faces is a very important skill, a very important social skill that we need for daily functioning. Someone who suffers from prosopagnosia like Heather Sellers would look at this image and these faces would not jump out at them. They would not see these faces that you and I most likely see. So what's going on here? Well, this is a great little case study to make the distinction between sensation and perception. Remember, Heather Sellers has perfect vision. So what is sensation? Sensation is detecting stimulation from the environment. Sensation occurs at our sense organs. So our sense organs would be our eyes, our ears, our skin, our tongue, our nose. These are our sense organs, and that's where we detect stimulation from the environment. Now, that stimulation could take many forms. For our eyes, it is light energy. For our ears, it is sound waves. For our skin, it is pressure or temperature. Now, our sense organs pick up on that stimulation from the environment and they send it off to our brain, which is where perception occurs. Perception is the process of interpreting that incoming sensory information into something meaningful, something recognizable. Perception occurs in the cortex. Remember, the cortex is the most advanced part of the brain, sits on top of the limbic system. So we have a distinction here between sensation and perception. Now, for the case of Heather Sellers and prosopagnosia, what process isn't working properly? Well, Sensation is working properly because her eyes work just fine. She has 20/20 vision, but there's something wrong with her perceptual processes. There is something not going right in her visual cortex so that she cannot recognize faces. So this is a perceptual problem, not a sensation problem. And this is kind of a reoccurring theme in sensation and perception. For the most part, we have a pretty good understanding of the sensation side of things. We know how our sense organs work. We know how they detect environmental stimulation, but we don't have a good understanding yet of perception. We don't really have a satisfactory explanation for how that sensory information is turned into something meaningful. All right, so let's take care of a couple important pieces of vocabulary here, starting with transduction. Transduction is when environmental energy is turned into neural communication. So environmental energy, let's say it's light. There's light bouncing around the room that we're in. It's bouncing around our environment all day long. Some of that light comes into our eye and strikes our retina. In our retina, that light energy is turned into action potentials by sensory neurons. That is the instance, the moment of transduction, where environmental energy is turned into neural communication or neural language in the form of action potentials. So light is turned into action potentials. That's transduction. So we have sensory neurons in each of our sense organs. They are sensitive to different forms of environmental energy. In our eyes, they're sensitive to light. In our ears, they're sensitive to sound waves, which is tiny, minute changes in pressure. All right. Another vocabulary term is sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation occurs when our sensory receptors are less responsive to unchanging stimuli. So, a couple examples here. Number one there, you don't hear an air conditioner until it turns off. I'm sure this has happened to you before. You're sitting in a room, the air conditioner comes on and you hear it. Let's say it runs for an hour and you don't hear it, but then it turns off and then you do hear it. So what's happening here? Your sensory receptors are less responsive during that hour that the air conditioner is making that humming noise. That humming noise is unchanging. It's actually boring for your sensory receptors. And that's what sensory adaptation is. Your sensory receptors are less responsive to that humming noise because it is consistent, it is unchanging for an hour. You only realize the air conditioner was even on once it turns off. This is boredom at the cellular level. Our sensory receptors are less sensitive, less responsive to things that do not change in our environment. Another example here. Are you sure you're still wearing clothes? This is kind of a silly example, but think about it. You wake up in the morning, you put your clothes on, and maybe you have a minute or two where you make sure everything is fitting properly. It's not too tight or bunched up in certain areas. It's not too loose. Everything's buttoned properly. It's all fitting the way it should be. Then you go on about your day and you don't really think about the fact that your clothes are constantly in contact with your skin. The sensory receptors on your skin are constantly providing that information that your clothes are still on your body, but you're not paying attention to it. You're less responsive to it. Think about how annoying it would be if you were constantly paying attention to the fact that you have a shirt on your back, or you were constantly paying attention to the fact that you have socks on your feet. That would be incredibly distracting. That is unimportant information. There's much more important information in our environment that we should be paying attention to. The last example there, think about some of the background noises that could be in your own environment right now. Is there a computer fan that's running? Is there traffic in the background? Is there maybe a roommate or a neighbor who's making some noise, playing some music? It's a good bet you probably didn't even hear those noises until you trained your attention on them. This really highlights the idea that what's important in our environment are changes. Changes in our environment are what are important, and that is what our sensory organs are tuned for. So that's transduction, sensory adaptation. Now, let's remind ourselves of one important thing. All action potentials are identical. They all look the same. Perception is based on the frequency of firing or the number of neurons firing in response to a specific stimulus. So let's say we have a very bright light. If you have a very bright light, maybe a neuron will fire very quickly, and our cortex will interpret that quick firing as a very bright light. But let's say we're exposed to a very dim light. Well, maybe a neuron is going to fire very infrequently, very slowly. Our cortex is going to perceive that slow firing rate as a very dim light. Same with number of neurons that fire in response to a specific stimulus. Let's say you're exposed to a very bright light, and that causes maybe 100 neurons to fire. Let's say you're exposed to a very dim light, and that causes maybe 10 neurons to fire. Our brain is going to pick up on the different number of neurons that respond to a specific stimulus and perceive that stimulus differently according to how many neurons fire. So that's the basis of perception. Our cortices, our cortex, is basically trying to interpret the different patterns of activation in our neurons, the different patterns of action potentials in our neurons. Okay, let's talk about absolute thresholds. So an absolute threshold is the minimum intensity of stimulus required to be perceived. For now, just forget about this at greater than chance level bit. Just focus on the first part there. Minimum intensity of stimulus required to be perceived. So in other words, this is the dimmest light that we can experience, the dimmest light that we can accurately perceive, or the most quiet sound that we can hear, or the softest touch that we can feel on our skin, or the least spicy thing that we can still sense some spiciness in. You have an absolute threshold for each sense, and they have established these absolute thresholds by putting people in experiments where they're exposed to very low intensity stimuli. So let's say a very dim light, and they slowly make the light brighter and brighter and brighter until the person can see it. And they do this for hundreds of people in hundreds of different types of experiments. And across all these different experiments, looking at all these different pieces of data, we have established absolute thresholds for every sense. We're going to look at the absolute thresholds on the next slide here, but I just want to briefly say that these absolute thresholds differ by organism. So there are critters on this planet who have more sensitive hearing than we do. Dogs have very sensitive hearing, much more sensitive than humans. They can hear sounds that we can't hear. Eagles have much more sensitive sight than we have. So our different sensory organisms are tuned to our specific evolved survival strategies. Eagles tend to survive by seeing prey from many, many miles away and going and getting that prey. We don't survive that way, so we don't need to have as sensitive of sight. All right, so let's take a look at some of those absolute thresholds for humans. Vision. You can see a candle flame 30 miles away. That is astounding. But again, this has been verified through experimentation. It's been replicated many times. A candle flame 30 miles away can be accurately seen by a person. Our sense of hearing, the absolute threshold here is a watch ticking 20 feet away. I don't know how many people wear watches that actually tick these days, but it is a very, very quiet sound. Smell, we can smell a drop of perfume in a 6-room house. Taste, we can taste a teaspoon of sugar in a gallon of water. And touch, we can feel the wing of a fly on our cheek if it is dropped from 1 centimeter. So again, these are the absolute thresholds. This is the lower extreme of what our senses can pick up. So a candle flame from 30 miles away, a watch ticking 20 feet away, those are pretty astounding. All right, so we have the basics of sensation and perception here. Talked about some foundational principles. Now I want to move into specifically our sense of sight. Sight is perhaps the most important sense that we have. It's often been said that humans have a sight-dominated brain. What that means is that we have a large portion of our cortex devoted to sight, to interpreting or perceiving sight sensory information. And we also have pretty sensitive sensory organs for sight. All right, so let's talk about sight. At the bottom of the slide here, we have the flow of information from our sensory receptors to our perceptual centers. So we have light energy bouncing around our environment. Some of that light energy enters our eye. It passes through the lens and the cornea, and it strikes our retina. The retina is made up of rod cells and cone cells. These rod cells and cone cells are sensitive to light, and when they are hit by light, they have action potentials. And remember, an action potential is just a slight little change in the electrical voltage of a neuron. And that action potential travels down the rod and cone cells, and it passes through a couple other intermediary cells and eventually gets to the optic nerve. And the optic nerve is just this little bundle of axons that allows action potentials to travel down. So the optic nerve takes that information and sends it on to the thalamus. And in the thalamus, we have some basic rudimentary sort of what you might call gatekeeping type of perception. This is where we have sort of censoring incoming information, throwing out the obviously unimportant pieces, throwing out the pieces we don't really need to pay attention to. The thalamus then relays that information to the visual cortex. And the visual cortex is where conscious sight occurs. That is where we are actually aware of what it is we are looking at. So to recap, light energy in our environment strikes our retina. Rod and cone cells are activated. That action potential activation is sent to the optic nerve. The optic nerve sends it on to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it on to the visual cortex. I have a short little video here, but I'm not going to play it. The audio just doesn't quite work right with this screen recording software that I'm using. So here we have the details of that process once again. I have some pictures to go along with it. These little squiggly lines represent light, and some of that light enters our eye through the cornea, through the lens. And on the back of our eye, we have the retina. The retina is where we have our rod and cone cells. And this little snippet here, this little rectangle, is blown up over here on the right side of our image. And this is what the retina actually looks like blown up. So on the back of our retina, which is at the bottom of the image, this is where the rod and cone cells are located. So light actually has to come in and navigate through all this other cellular mass before it actually reaches the rod cells or the cone cells. So once light reaches the rod and cone cells, they become activated. They have action potentials. And they send that electrical energy along these intermediary cells, the ganglion cells and the bipolar neurons, and they eventually reach the optic nerve cells. And the optic nerve cells take that information, send it along the optic nerve onto the thalamus, and then eventually onto the visual cortex. So light enters the eye, hits the retina full of our rod or cone cells. They have action potentials. The optic nerve takes that information, sends it onto the thalamus for some basic rudimentary processing, and then the thalamus sends it on to the visual cortex for conscious processing. Real quickly here in the bottom left of our image, we have an actual electron microscope image of our retina, and you can kind of see the different rod and cone shaped cells there. All right, so that's sight in a nutshell. That's the flow of information all the way from our retina to our visual cortex. So let's talk briefly about the differences between rods and cones. We have roughly 6 million cones in our retina and roughly 120 million rods in our retina. So many more rods than cones. But they're specialized cells. They have different functions. Cones tend to be concentrated in the center of our retina. This is what we call the fovea. This is the center of our visual field. This is what we're actually focused on in our visual field. Rods are dispersed elsewhere. They're surrounding the fovea, surrounding the center of our retina. Sensitivity in dim light. Cones have very low sensitivity in dim light. Rods have a very high sensitivity in dim light. A great example is if you've ever been stargazing in a dark outside area. If you've ever tried to look directly at a dim star, you'll find that it's a little hard to do. As soon as you look at it, that star kind of disappears. It's really hard to see. But if you shift your vision just a little bit and you're looking off to the side, you can actually see that dim star a little